Okay, so we're going to go very briefly over autonomic nervous system pharmacology. And this is very important, especially if you're going to medicine, pharmacology, or nursing, because this is a powerful way of affecting, or many medicines that we use in, like, especially emergency situations, they affect the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Now, we have to go very briefly over these two terms, ligands and receptors. So ligand is a molecule that binds to a receptor, but in this case, I'm talking about protein receptors, these membrane receptors. So this is some sort of protein found in the plasma membrane of a cell that receives and a ligand binds to. So I like to think of it like a lock and a key, because why you have the lock, that's like the receptor, and the key is the ligand that turns the lock and activates the lock. So membrane receptors, again, in this case I'm talking about the protein, the molecule, not the entire cell. So it's not sensory cells or neurons I'm talking about. You can have membrane receptors on sensory receptors, but they're not the same thing. So they both, when you have ligands, they bind to receptors and cause some sort of change in intracellular activity. And you can have different receptors for the same ligand. So different receptors can cause different changes. So in general, when you have ligand and receptor, this is kind of like the flow of activity. Yeah, and this is from Khan Academy. So ligand binds to receptor, and the steps in between depends on the cell, depends on the receptor, but you get some sort of change in the cell when the ligand binds to a receptor. So just like turning the key in your car's ignition turns on your car, a ligand binding to a receptor on a cell causes some sort of cell response. Now, agonists and antagonists, especially if you're going to medicine and pharmacology, you gotta know what this is. So agonists, just like in our muscles and movements, right? So agonist is something that does something, and an antagonist blocks or undoes something. So we're talking about ligands and receptors. An agonist activates a receptor, an antagonist would block off this whole thing. So it would still be a ligand, but it's going to block the receptor. It's also going to shut off this response over here. Now, with the sympathetic nervous system, remember, like, if you need a review of this, go back to the previous lecture about preganglionic and postganglionic neurons. So we do have neurotransmitters between the preganglionic and the postganglionic neurons. And these neurotransmitters are ligands. So these are molecules such as the very familiar acetylcholine. And the receptor it binds to at this synapse between the preganglionic and postganglionic neuron are called nicotinic receptors. So it sounds like nicotine, right? And this is how we discovered it. We're like, oh yeah, nicotine activates the receptors. But it's not just nicotine. You also have your natural activator of this is acetylcholine. Now, what happens is this is, again, ligand binds to receptor. It's going to cause some cellular change. So the cellular change you have with the postganglionic neuron is it's going to release a neurotransmitter. Depends on where the location, depends on where it is. There are many neurotransmitters, but the main two are norepinephrine and epinephrine from the postganglionic neurons. So what we have here are these receptors, and there's not just one receptor that are found on target organs of sympathetic fibers. There are two broad categories and subtypes of these categories. The two main types of receptors are alpha-adrenergic receptors and beta-adrenergic receptors. And don't think so a common misconception is that, okay, epinephrine only binds to one, norepinephrine only binds to this 2 beta. Actually, either can bind to either receptor. So it's like epinephrine can bind to both alpha and beta. Norepinephrine can also bind to both alpha and beta. So a mnemonic for this is SAN-bean, and you're like, wait, what? What does that mean? Well, I'll break down the mnemonic. So sympathetic, that's why it's SAN. But the acetylcholine, this is where the SAN part comes from. It talks about this synapse right here. So what you have, the neurotransmitter at the synapse is acetylcholine. The receptors at this preganglionic, postganglionic synapse are nicotinic receptors. Now this part right here refers to everything from the postganglionic neuron and the target cell or organ. And again, don't get confused that think it's just epinephrine beta, norepinephrine alpha. It's not one-to-one. So either of them can bind to either of these adrenergic receptors. Now, you're like, wait, what? So let's talk about epinephrine and norepinephrine real quick. So epinephrine comes from Greek, so it actually means like epi, like above or outer, right? And nephron refers to the kidney, so it's saying above the kidney. That's where you would find the adrenal medulla, right? And adrenaline comes from Latin, so renal refers to the kidney, and ad refers to this location next to the kidney. So the funny thing is that both of them mean on top or above the kidney. So this is the source of these adrenal epinephrine, norepinephrine. So or one of the major sources of epinephrine, norepinephrine. Now, norepinephrine is the same thing as noradrenaline. So epinephrine is the same thing as adrenaline. And I think adrenaline is used more in Commonwealth countries such as Australia and the United Kingdom. But when you hear adrenaline, it's the same thing as epinephrine. So again, thus norepinephrine is the same thing as noradrenaline. Common misconception, norepinephrine is not the same thing as epinephrine. Adrenaline is not the same as noradrenaline. So it's just like this is equal to this is equal to this. So again, norepinephrine is not the same thing as epinephrine. It is related, but it's different. So epinephrine has this extra methyl group over here. Norepinephrine doesn't have that group. So they are different chemically. But whether you use epinephrine or adrenaline, it depends on the hospital, depends on the location. But again, adrenaline is the same thing as epinephrine. That's the main point here. So there is a difference between norepi and epi, and between noradrenaline and adrenaline, but adrenaline equals epinephrine. Yeah, so this is also an interesting thing too. Like it's also related to dopamine as well. This is how you're actually able to make norepinephrine and epinephrine and why they're so similar. They come from the same original molecule. Okay, so there's receptors in the autonomic nervous system. So this is an interesting thing. There you have the alpha-adrenergic receptors, but there are two subtypes, and alpha-1 and alpha-2. And then the beta-adrenergic receptors, there are three subtypes, so beta-1, beta-2, and beta-3. Now, both of them, so all of these receptors can bind to epinephrine or norepinephrine. This isn't a full biochemistry class, but there is different, like what they call affinities, for those of you who know a little more about chemistry. But yeah, don't worry too much about it for this class. And if you're using the OpenStax version, they have an error. And this is actually an errata I submitted earlier this year because I'm like, that's wrong. And they acknowledged it's wrong. So the OpenStax does have an error. It says there are three subtypes of alpha. That's wrong. Pointing out right here, there are supposed to be three subtypes of beta, two subtypes of alpha. So they haven't corrected it yet, but just FYI if you're using OpenStax. Okay, so to drive home the point, you have alpha-1, alpha-2, beta-1, beta-2, beta-3, and epinephrine can bind any of these, and same with norepinephrine. It can bind any of these adrenergic receptors. Now, you might look at that previous table in the notes and see like, wait, it says alpha-1 excites, but alpha-2 inhibits. So if you have epinephrine in your system, well, isn't it kind of like counterbalancing itself? Well, again, this is where the concept of different receptors, different effects. Not every cell is going to have every single type of receptor on its surface. So what your cells do to kind of select for what activity they want is that they only will have certain receptors on their surface. So epinephrine will only have, like if you want a cell that only causes excitation response to sympathetic activity, maybe you want only alpha-1 receptors on there. So this is how your body is able to determine different, so same chemicals, same epinephrine, norepinephrine, but by changing which receptors are on a cell, you can change its response to sympathetic or parasympathetic activity. Now, parasympathetic neurotransmission, let's go over this real quick. So preganglionic and postganglionic, what we have is that target organ. So we have, luckily, this is pretty easy. Between preganglionic and postganglionic, in both sympathetic and parasympathetic, you have nicotinic receptors, so that's pretty easy. But when you have the postganglionic neuron in the parasympathetic nervous system, you instead of releasing norepinephrine and epinephrine, you have acetylcholine being released, and this is going to bind to muscarinic receptors. So there are no adrenergic receptors in the parasympathetic nervous system, you have muscarinic. And luckily the mnemonic is a little easier here. So this is why it's pan, because why? You have parasympathetic up there, and then the pan part refers to this acetylcholine binding to nicotinic receptors. And this part right here, the am part, refers to acetylcholine binding to muscarinic receptors. The acetylcholine being released by postganglionic neuron, and muscarinic receptors being on the surface of tissues or organs that respond to parasympathetic activity. Now, nicotinic receptors, there are many types. Don't worry about this for this class. Again, if you're going to pharmacology or med school, yeah, you kind of have to know those. But yeah, don't worry about them for this class because it is a rabbit hole. Muscarinic receptors, there are subtypes, but compared to the alpha and beta ones, I don't want you to really focus on that. Maybe that's more reserved for advanced A&P and definitely more of a med school, pharm school kind of topic. So, but both of these receptors are found in the parasympathetic nervous system, and both of them are binding to acetylcholine. So there's something called nicotine, there's something called muscarine, but in your parasympathetic nervous system, the natural activators are acetylcholine. So again, acetylcholine is super powerful neurotransmitter. You have it with your neuromuscular junctions, and you have it in your autonomic nervous system. So this is why acetylcholine is super important.